My sweet child, come sit beside me. Let me tell you a story that has lived in my heart for 70 years. A story of love and loss, of dreams and heartbreak, of a life lived through the storms and sunshine that make us who we are. I was born in the spring of 1947, in a small village nestled between rolling hills and endless fields of wildflowers. My parents named me Elena, after my great-grandmother, a woman whose strength they said lived on in my blood. When I was 8 years old, our world was small but complete. We lived in a white cottage with green shutters where morning glories climbed up wooden trellises, and my mother's roses bloomed in every color imaginable. My father James was a carpenter, whose hands could coax beauty from the roughest wood. My mother Margaret was a seamstress whose needle could create magic from simple fabric. And my little brother Thomas, 2 years younger than me, had eyes like summer sky and a laugh that could chase away any shadow. Our days began before sunrise. I would wake to the sound of Papa lighting the kitchen fire and Mama humming old lullabies as she prepared breakfast. The smell of fresh bread and brewing tea would fill our little home like a warm embrace. After breakfast, Thomas and I would walk to the village school, where Miss Caroline taught children of all ages with a voice that could make even arithmetic sound like poetry. Those were the golden days. Days when my biggest worry was whether I had enough time after school to help Thomas catch fireflies in mason jars, or whether the baker would have any sweet rolls left. We were poor by some standards, but we were rich in love, rich in community, rich in the simple pleasures that make childhood magical. But life has a way of teaching us that happiness is as fragile as soap bubbles floating on summer air. The first shadow fell across our lives in the winter of 1956, when I was 9 years old. Papa had been coughing for weeks, a deep rattling cough that seemed to come from somewhere dark and hollow in his chest. Mama tried to hide her worry behind busy hands and forced smiles, but I could see it in the way she watched Papa when she thought no one was looking. Dr. Morrison came to visit, a tall, thin man with kind eyes who spoke in hushed tones, with Mama in the kitchen while Thomas and I pretended to play nearby. That night, after Thomas had fallen asleep beside me, I crept to the top of the stairs and listened to my parents talking by the dying fire. Papa's voice was weaker than I'd ever heard it, and Mama was crying. Not the loud tears of a child, but the quiet, desperate weeping of a woman watching her world crack apart. "The doctor says it's consumption, Margaret," Papa whispered. And even though I was only 9, I knew that consumption was a word that meant goodbye. Spring came early that year, but it brought no joy to our little cottage. Papa grew thinner and paler with each passing day, though he tried so hard to smile for Thomas and me. He would still sit with us in the evenings, reading stories from his worn leather book, his voice growing softer with each page. On a Tuesday morning in April, when the apple trees were just beginning to bloom, Papa didn't get out of bed. I remember standing in the doorway, watching Mama sit beside him, holding his hand and singing the old lullabies, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Elena," Papa called to me, his voice barely a whisper. I climbed carefully onto the bed beside him. His hand was so thin, so cold, but his eyes still held all the love in the world. "My beautiful girl," he said, "you must take care of your Mama and Thomas for me." I nodded, even though I didn't really understand what he was asking. "I promise, Papa," I whispered. "And Elena," he continued, "remember that love never dies. Even when people go away, the love they leave behind stays forever. It lives in your heart, in your memories, in the way you treat others." Those were the last words my father ever spoke to me. He passed away that afternoon while Thomas and I were at school, with Mama holding his hand and the afternoon sun streaming across their bed like golden ribbons. The funeral was held on a Thursday. The entire village came. Farmers in their best suits, women in black dresses carrying flowers, children who stared at Thomas and me with wide, uncertain eyes. But the hardest part came after, when everyone went home to their own families, and we were left with the deafening silence of loss. Summer came, but it felt different. Like the sun was shining through grey cloth. Mama tried to keep things normal, but there were changes. The savings Papa and Mama had tucked away began to dwindle. Mama took in more sewing, working by candlelight, long after we had gone to bed, her needle moving in steady, desperate rhythms. I began to understand that childhood was a luxury we could no longer afford. At 9 years old, I learned to cook simple meals when Mama was too tired. I learned to mend Thomas's torn clothes and comfort him when he cried for Papa in the middle of the night. I learned that sometimes being strong means pretending you're not scared, even when fear sits in your stomach like a cold stone. Thomas was only 7 and couldn't quite grasp why Papa had gone away. He would set a place for Papa at dinner and save half his bread roll for when Papa gets hungry. It broke Mama's heart every time, but she never scolded him. She would gently move Papa's plate back to the cupboard and tell Thomas that Papa was watching us from heaven. Autumn brought news that would change our lives forever. Mrs. Henderson, who owned our cottage, came to visit on a grey October morning. She sat at our kitchen table, wringing her hands and speaking in the careful voice adults use when they're about to break a child's heart. "Margaret," she said, "I'm so sorry, but I need to sell the cottage. My husband's business is failing, and we need the money." Mama's face went white as fresh snow. "How long do we have?" she whispered. "Until Christmas," Mrs. Henderson replied, not meeting our eyes. That night, Mama sat Thomas and me down and explained that we would have to leave our home, leave our village, leave everything we'd ever known. We were going to the city, she said, where there would be more work for her as a seamstress. I watched Thomas's face crumple like paper in a fire. "But what about Papa?" he asked. "How will he find us if we're not here?" Mama pulled him into her arms, and I could see her struggling not to cry. "Papa will always know where to find us," she whispered. "Love doesn't need an address." We left Rosehaven on a cold December morning, carrying everything we owned in 2 battered suitcases and a cloth bag. The train ride to the city took 4 hours, and I pressed my face to the window, watching the rolling hills and familiar fields disappear behind us. The city was a monster of smoke and noise and people who moved too fast and never smiled. We found a room in a boarding house on Maple Street. One small room with a single bed that the 3 of us shared, a tiny wash basin, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. Mama found work at a dress factory, sewing from dawn until dusk for wages that barely paid for our room and food. I enrolled Thomas and myself at the neighborhood school, where the teacher was stern, and the children looked at us with suspicious eyes because our clothes were old and our shoes had holes. Those first months in the city were the hardest of my life. Thomas cried himself to sleep every night, begging to go home. Mama came back from the factory each evening with her fingers bleeding from the needlework and her eyes red from strain. And I tried to hold us all together, even though I was only 10 years old and felt like I was drowning. But even in the darkest times, small lights can shine through. Mrs. O'Brien, who ran the boarding house, began leaving extra portions of soup outside our door. She never said anything about it, just pretended it was a mistake when we thanked her. At school, I met Sarah, a girl with freckles and kind eyes who shared her lunch with me when she noticed I had none. She became my first friend in the city, and through her, I learned that even in a place that seemed cold and unfriendly, there were warm hearts if you knew how to look for them. Thomas slowly began to adjust, too. He made friends with the boy who lived in the room next to ours, and they would play marbles in the hallway while Mama and I prepared our simple dinners on the hot plate we were allowed to use. Mama's skill as a seamstress was noticed at the factory. After 6 months, she was promoted to a position that paid better wages and allowed her to work fewer hours. We moved to a slightly larger room with 2 beds and a window that actually had a view of a small park across the street. By the time I turned 12, I had learned lessons that most children never need to know. I could stretch $1 until it screamed, cook a meal from almost nothing, and read the worry lines on Mama's face like a map of our troubles. I also learned to dream in whispers. At night, when Thomas and Mama were sleeping, I would lie awake and imagine the life I wanted to have someday. A house with a garden where I could grow roses like Mama used to. A husband who would love me the way Papa loved Mama. Children who would never know the fear of not having enough to eat or a place to sleep. When I was 13, something wonderful and terrifying happened. A boy named Michael started walking me home from school. He was 15, tall and handsome, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right into my soul. He had moved to the city with his family from Ireland, and like us, he knew what it meant to start over in a place that didn't always welcome strangers. Michael would carry my books and tell me stories about Ireland, about green hills that rolled to the sea, and castles that had stood for 1,000 years. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed since Papa died, and slowly, carefully, like a flower opening to sunlight, I began to fall in love. Michael and I were inseparable through my 14th and 15th years. He worked at the docks during the day, loading and unloading ships, and in the evenings he would come to see me. We would sit on the front steps of the boarding house and talk for hours about everything and nothing. He told me about his dreams of saving enough money to bring his grandparents over from Ireland. I told him about Papa and the village we had left behind. We shared our fears and hopes like precious gifts, and in doing so, we created our own little world within the harsh reality of city life. When I turned 16, Michael asked me to marry him. He didn't have a ring. We were both too poor for such luxuries. But he gave me a small wooden cross that his grandfather had carved. "Someday," he promised, "I'll give you everything you deserve. A real home, a real wedding, a real life." I said yes without hesitation. I loved him with the fierce, absolute love that only the young can feel. The kind of love that believes it can conquer anything, overcome any obstacle, survive any storm. We planned to marry when I turned 18. Michael was working double shifts at the docks, saving every penny he could. I had found work as a seamstress like Mama, and together we dreamed of the little apartment we would rent, the children we would have, the life we would build together. But history has a way of interrupting personal plans. In December of 1941, when I was barely 17, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and America entered the war that had already been tearing Europe apart. Michael enlisted immediately. "It's my duty," he told me, holding my hands in his calloused ones. "This country gave my family a chance when Ireland couldn't feed us. Now it's time for me to give something back." I begged him to wait, to think it over, but I could see in his eyes that his mind was made up. We were married in a quick ceremony at City Hall 3 days before he shipped out for basic training. I wore Mama's best dress, altered to fit me, and carried a small bouquet of daisies that Sarah had helped me pick from the park across the street. Our honeymoon was one night in a small hotel room where we held each other and tried to memorize every detail. The sound of each other's breathing, the feel of each other's heartbeat, the way the moonlight looked on our intertwined hands. The next morning I stood on the platform at Union Station and watched my husband board a train that would take him away from me. He pressed his face to the window and mouthed, "I love you," as the train pulled away, and I mouthed it back, tasting tears I hadn't realized I was crying. For the next 2 years, Michael and I lived through letters. He wrote to me from training camps in Georgia and California, from ships crossing the Pacific, from islands whose names I couldn't pronounce. His letters painted pictures of homesickness and camaraderie, of fear and determination, of a young man growing older faster than he should have had to. I wrote back every day, telling him about my work at the dress factory, about Thomas growing tall and strong at 15, about Mama's gradual recovery from the grief that had shadowed her for so long. I tried to keep my letters cheerful, but sometimes my loneliness leaked through despite my best efforts. "I count the days until you come home," I wrote in one letter. "I've counted 847 days so far, and each one feels like a year." His letters came less frequently as time went on, sometimes because of military censorship, sometimes because of the chaos of war, sometimes for reasons I didn't want to think about. But when they did come, I would read them over and over until the paper was soft from handling and the words were memorized in my heart. In his last letter, dated March 15th, 1944, Michael wrote, "Elena, my darling wife, I dream about you every night. I dream about the house we'll buy when I come home, with a garden where you can grow those roses you've always wanted. I dream about the children we'll have, and the stories I'll tell them about their brave, beautiful mother, who kept our love alive while I was away. Hold on to those dreams, my love. They're what keep me fighting." On April 3rd, 1944, a Western Union boy came to the boarding house with a telegram addressed to Mrs. Michael O'Connor. My hands shook so badly I could barely open it. The words swam before my eyes. "The War Department regrets to inform you that your husband, Corporal Michael O'Connor, was killed in action on March 20th, 1944, while serving his country in the Pacific Theater." I read those words over and over, but they didn't make sense. How could Michael be dead when I had just received a letter from him 5 days ago? How could he be gone when I could still feel his arms around me, still hear his voice whispering promises in my ear? Mama found me 3 hours later, still sitting on my bed, still holding the telegram, staring at nothing. She took one look at my face and knew. Without saying a word, she sat beside me and pulled me into her arms, and we cried together. For Michael, for Papa, for all the men who wouldn't be coming home to the women who loved them. The grief was different this time. When Papa died, it was a slow, expected goodbye. But Michael's death was like being struck by lightning, sudden, shocking, leaving me stunned and disoriented. I was 19 years old and already a widow. I had been married for 2 years and 2 months, and most of that time my husband had been an ocean away. The months that followed were a blur of numbness and pain. I moved through my days like a sleepwalker, going to work at the factory, coming home to the boarding house, eating meals I couldn't taste, sleeping dreams I couldn't remember. Mama worried about me. Thomas, now 16 and working at a grocery store after school, would try to make me laugh with jokes and stories. But I felt as though I had forgotten how to smile. Sarah stayed close by my side, understanding without words that sometimes friendship means just sitting quietly with someone who's drowning in sorrow. It was Mrs. O'Brien who finally shook me out of my grief stupor. She came to my room one evening in October, 6 months after Michael's death, and sat down on my bed with the no-nonsense air of someone who had seen too much sadness to waste time on gentle approaches. "Elena," she said, "that boy of yours loved you something fierce. I could see it in his eyes every time he looked at you. Now, do you think he'd want you to waste away like this? Do you think he'd want the girl he married to disappear just because he's not here to hold her hand?" Her words hit me like cold water on a sleeping face. She was right, and I knew it. Michael had loved life, loved laughter, loved dreams and possibilities. If I spent the rest of my life mourning, I would be betraying everything he had believed in. That night, for the first time since the telegram arrived, I wrote in the journal I had kept throughout our marriage. "My dearest Michael," I wrote, "I promise to live, not just to exist, but to really live, for both of us, slowly, carefully, like a plant growing toward sunlight. I began to rebuild my life. I took evening classes in bookkeeping, thinking it might lead to better work than the factory. I started visiting the library again, losing myself in books the way I had as a child. I even began to laugh at Thomas's jokes, though it felt strange at first, like using muscles I had forgotten I had. In 1946, 2 years after Michael's death, I met William. He was a librarian, quiet and gentle, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had lost his first wife to tuberculosis and understood grief in the way that only those who have lived through it can understand. We began as friends, talking about books over cups of coffee in the library's small break room. William never tried to replace Michael in my heart. He understood that first loves leave permanent imprints on the soul. Instead, he offered me something different: companionship, stability, and a quiet kind of love that felt like coming home after a long journey. When William proposed in 1947, he did so with complete honesty about what he was offering. "Elena," he said, "I know I'm not your great romantic love, but I love you deeply, and I would be honored to build a life with you. We could have a good life together. Maybe not the life you planned when you were 19, but a good life nonetheless." I said yes because I had learned that there are many kinds of love and all of them have value. The passionate, consuming love I had shared with Michael was like a shooting star, brilliant and brief. The love William offered was like a steady candle flame, quieter but no less real, and capable of lighting the way through many dark nights. William and I were married in a small ceremony in 1947, 30 years old, and both on our second chance at happiness. We rented a house on Elm Street, not the house of my childhood dreams, but a solid, comfortable place with a small backyard where I could plant a garden. Our first child, James, named for my father, was born in 1948. Holding him in my arms for the first time, I understood what people meant when they talked about miracles. Here was this perfect little person, made from love and hope, carrying the future in his tiny hands. Our daughter Mary came 2 years later, followed by Robert in 1952 and little Susan in 1954. Our house filled with laughter and tears, scraped knees and bedtime stories, birthday parties and Christmas mornings. William was a wonderful father, patient, loving, always ready with a book to read or a puzzle to solve together. Mama lived with us until she passed peacefully in her sleep in 1955. She got to see all 4 of her grandchildren, and they adored their gentle grandmother, who told them stories about a magical village called Rosehaven, and a grandfather they never met, but who lived on in the stories she shared. Thomas married his childhood sweetheart from the boarding house and moved to California, where he started a successful business importing goods from Europe. We wrote letters regularly, and he would visit with his growing family every summer, filling our house with even more children's voices and reminding me of the little boy who once saved bread rolls for Papa. The 1960s brought changes I hadn't expected. The children grew up as children do, and one by one they left home to build their own lives. James became a doctor, Mary a teacher, Robert an engineer, and Susan followed her artistic dreams to art school in New York. William and I entered that strange, quiet phase of marriage, when the house suddenly feels too big and too quiet. When you have to remember how to be a couple again after so many years of being parents first. We took up traveling, visiting places we had only read about in books. Europe, where we saw the castles Michael had described from his Irish stories. California, where we spent time with Thomas and his family. New York, where we marveled at Susan's paintings in her first gallery showing. In 1968, William had his first heart attack. It was mild, the doctors said, but it was a warning that our time together was not infinite. We began to live more intentionally, saying, "I love you" more often, taking fewer things for granted, understanding that every ordinary Tuesday was a gift we might not have forever. William retired from the library in 1970, and we spent his retirement years gardening together, reading to each other in the evenings, and spoiling our grandchildren when they came to visit. He taught me to appreciate the beauty in quiet moments, the way morning light fell across our kitchen table, the sound of rain on the roof, the feeling of his hand in mine after 40 years of marriage. William's second heart attack came in 1975, and this time, it was not mild. I spent 3 days in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by our children and grandchildren, praying to a God I sometimes doubted, but never stopped hoping might be listening. When William died, I was 68 years old and facing my second widowhood. But this grief was different from the sharp, shocking pain of losing Michael. This was deeper, quieter. The ache of losing not just a husband, but a life partner, a best friend, the person who had shared 30 years of ordinary moments that had somehow added up to an extraordinary life. At William's funeral, James stood up to speak about his stepfather. "William taught us," he said, "that love isn't always lightning strikes and shooting stars. Sometimes love is choosing to be kind every day for 40 years. Sometimes love is reading bedtime stories until your voice is hoarse, or tending someone's garden because you know it makes them happy, or simply being present in all the small moments that make up a life." After the funeral, our house on Elm Street felt impossibly empty. The children wanted me to sell it, to move to a smaller place or come live with one of them. But I couldn't bear to leave the home where we had raised our family, where every room held memories of scraped knees, kissed better, and Christmas mornings and quiet evenings reading together by lamplight. I lived alone in that house for 10 years, from 1975 to 1985. They were not lonely years exactly, but they were solitary ones. I learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, and discovered that solitude can be a gift if you know how to unwrap it. I took up writing, something I had always wanted to do but never had time for during the busy years of raising children. I wrote stories about Rosehaven, about the village of my childhood that lived on only in memory. I wrote about Papa and Mama, about Thomas and the adventures we had shared as children. I wrote about Michael and the love that had burned bright and brief, and about William and the love that had sustained me through decades of ordinary days. My grandchildren began to visit more often, drawn perhaps by the stories I told and the cookies I kept in constant supply. They would sit in the kitchen while I cooked, listening to tales of their parents' childhoods and asking endless questions about what life was like. In the old days, it was during one of these visits that my granddaughter Lily, you, my dear one, first asked me to tell her about my life. You were only 5 then, but you listened with such serious attention, as if you understood that these stories were important, that they were part of your story too. In 1985, when I was 78, I had a fall that convinced my children I could no longer live alone safely. We sold the house on Elm Street, and I moved in with James and his wife Margaret, named for my mother, in this smaller house where I live now. It was a difficult transition at first. After 60 years of running my own household, it was hard to step back and let others take care of me. But gradually, I found peace in this new role. Grandmother, storyteller, keeper of family memories. I watched my grandchildren grow up, graduate from school, fall in love, start families of their own. I held great-grandchildren in my arms and saw in their faces echoes of Papa, of Michael, of William, of all the people who had shaped our family story. I understood that while individual lives end, love continues, passed down through generations like a sacred flame. Your mother brought you to visit when you were born, and I held you and whispered the same words Papa had said to me. Love never dies. It lives in your heart, in your memories, in the way you treat others. And now here we are, my sweet child, at the end of my story, and perhaps near the end of my life. I am 75 years old, and my body is growing tired, but my heart is still full of love, still full of memories, still full of hope for your generation and the ones that will come after. I have lived through a Great Depression and a World War, through loss and love, through the ordinary sorrows and extraordinary joys that make up a human life. I have buried parents and husbands, raised children and grandchildren, planted gardens and watched them bloom, written stories and lived them. What have I learned in all these years? I have learned that love takes many forms, and all of them are sacred. I have learned that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every time you fall. I have learned that happiness isn't a destination you arrive at, but moments of grace you notice along the way. I have learned that every person you meet is carrying a story, and if you listen carefully enough, you might hear the echoes of your own story in theirs. I have learned that kindness costs nothing, but can change everything, and that hope is not naive optimism, but a choice we make every day to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Most importantly, my darling girl, I have learned that we are all connected, to each other, to the people who came before us, to the ones who will come after. The love your great-great-grandfather James had for his family flows through your veins. The dreams your great-great-grandmother Margaret stitched into fabric with her needle live on in the care you show for others. The courage Michael showed on a battlefield in the Pacific, the steady devotion William showed in 30 years of small kindnesses, all of it is part of who you are. You carry their stories now, just as someday your children will carry yours. And in that carrying, in that remembering, they live on. Not in the dramatic way that stories often tell us people live forever, but in the real way, in the values they taught, in the love they gave, in the choices you make because of the lessons they left behind. When I am gone, and I will be gone someday, sweet child, because that is the way of things, I want you to remember this story. I want you to remember that you come from people who survived impossible things, who loved deeply despite loss, who found ways to hope even in the darkest times. And I want you to remember that your story is just beginning. You will face sorrows I cannot protect you from and joys I cannot imagine. You will love and lose and love again. You will make mistakes and find grace. You will discover strengths you didn't know you had and overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. But through it all, remember that you are part of something larger than yourself. You are part of a story that began long before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. You are part of a legacy of love that no amount of loss can diminish. And so, my precious granddaughter, this is where my story ends, and yours begins. Take these words, these memories, these lessons learned through tears and laughter, and make them part of your own tale. Add your own chapters of courage and kindness, of dreams pursued and love shared. Remember that every ending is also a beginning, that every goodbye makes room for a new hello, that every story told keeps alive the people who lived it. The sun is setting now outside our window, painting the sky in the same colors that lit my childhood evenings in Rosehaven so many years ago. Time is circular like that. What was will be again. What is now has been before. What will be carries the seeds of what has always been. Hold my hand now, as we watch the day end and the stars begin their ancient dance across the sky. Listen to the sound of your own heartbeat, steady and strong, carrying forward the rhythm of all the hearts that beat before yours. This is how stories live on, my dear one. Not in books on shelves, but in hearts that remember, in hands that hold, in voices that speak truth and love across the generations. This is how love never dies.